Future Now Show. Brought to you by the Club of Amsterdam.
Well, this is a very nice opportunity to talk to you guys at Club of Amsterdam and on this podcast. I have been involved in future studies and working as a futurist for a very long time. My name is Glen Hiemstra. I live in Seattle, Washington. In the early 1990s, I founded futurist.com. And I did that simply by registering futurist.com, not by buying it from somebody. In my early life, I had been a college professor in the field of communications. But in many ways, I had really begun thinking of myself as a futurist and even doing some professional work as a futurist going all the way back to, 1980. So it's a very long time for me. In the 1970s, I was a college student at a college in the town of Spokane, Washington, which is a small city on the eastern side of the state of Washington here in the U.S. And they had hired as the president of that college a guy named Ed Lindemann. And Ed had come to the college direct from the Apollo spacecraft program. Appropriately enough, this is coming up on the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon. And he had been in charge of the building of the command module vehicle that had gone to the moon, and then the integration of all those vehicles. And he left that in the 1970s to become a college president. That's who he was. And he, in his very first presentation to the college, at which I was a student, got up and said, "I'm a futurist." And I thought, well, now what's that? That sounds like a really interesting thing to be. And he was an early member of the World Future Society and was very involved in trying to think about how does one think about the future. And he introduced me to 3 or 4 of what became then the key influences for me early in my career, and led to the kind of approach to futuring that I do and have done all these years. The first of those was somebody that those of you in the Netherlands might know. I don't know if the younger set pays much attention to him, but we all did back then, and that was Fred Polak, the Dutch really early founder, one of the early founders of future studies, and the writer of that great 2-book series, The Image of the Future. And the whole concept that this space guy, Lindemann, had drawn from Polak and then from others that he had been reading and in those early days of future studies was the image of the future was powerful. That the most important thing that a person could do, and that when a person who was a futurist could help an organization or a city do, was to develop an image of the future. So then what image would that be? The way Polak had written it was that the image of the future in his historical studies, the image of the future tends to, as he said, precede or accompany the rise and fall of civilizations or of societies, and one could extend that then to perhaps organizations and so on. And that is, if the image of the future is one that is positive, that is, as he put it, flourishing, it can draw the organization or the civilization forward. But again, as Polak put it, if the image of the future becomes malign or negative or one of decay, then the decay of the civilization or the organization follows. And so the idea, particularly, and I think this was true pretty widely in the early future studies world, and certainly among early futurists that I knew in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, was that the real task was to get organizations, and that would be, again, it might be a community, it might be a company, it might be a nonprofit organization, whatever it might be, to develop a vision for or an image of the future. We tended to call it a vision. And so, and then I met other people in the early futurist community in the early 1980s, as I was I was still teaching as a college professor, but beginning to do some futures work with organizations with communities in particular in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. who were interested in developing kind of sort of long-range visions for their communities. And so then I was influenced by a couple of other futurists, Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was a real visionary futurist, and her favorite mantra was, as we see our future, so we act, and as we act, so we become. So her whole thing was to help people also develop these kind of long-range, expansive, positive visions of the future. And then a third one was Robert Theobald, who was an American futurist. He was a descendant of a Scottish preacher, and he was one who tended to emphasize a little bit more warning people about the negative consequences of our behavior, laying out sort of more the threat scenarios, if you will, and warning people that if we don't change our ways, kind of in the tradition of his Scottish preacher father, if we don't change our ways, we're going to end up with a future that we don't want. So then you had these kind of two poles between these influences on me. One side saying, no, the most important thing you can do as a futurist is to help people develop a positive vision for the future. And another side, particularly this Theobald side, saying, no, the most important thing you can do is to help people see the negative trends and that are emerging. In today's world, that would be climate change, of course. And to really warn them that if we don't change our behavior, then we're going to end up in a really negative future. So those two kind of ideas competed among those who influenced me in my early career as a futurist. As the World Wide Web was getting started in the early 1990s, then I left higher education as a professor and began doing this full-time work as a futurist. And I would say that virtually all of my work in the 1990s and through really the turn of the century was focused on the concept of the preferred future. The way I would say it, laid it out was, there were these three essential questions about the future that one would ask if you're interested in the future. And one would be, what is probably going to happen? What are the trends? So, if we looked at trends, of course, you would see, well, in parts of the world, the whole world, the population is getting older, and that's having a big impact in some regions and countries in the world. Or birth rates are increasing or birth rates are decreasing wherever you might be looking. That's a probable future. Or, of course, what we all now know is likely to happen if global warming and the emission of greenhouse gases continues. That's obviously a probable future. So that's one question. The second question is what's possible. And that's sort of where you try to encourage people to think outside the boundaries, as we used to say, think outside the box and ask, well, what if we did this, or what if we did that, or what if this became possible? Then what could the future look like? But then the third question is, what is your preferred future, was always the ultimate question that I tried to push those clients that I was working with to ultimately consider. And in fact, the way I would say it was, what you do is you explore the first two questions, the probable future and the possible future, so that you can answer the question, what is your preferred future? And describe it in the form of a vision. And often that would be a relatively more than a simple, but less than a real long vision statement, but a vision that would have enough content to it that people could begin to see things that they should do, in particular things that they should do differently if we wanted to move in the direction of this preferred future. So that was the core of my work. I would still say that it is here in the year 2019. I think I'm a little bit more unusual in doing that work than I was in the 1990s, because I think there's been an evolution in the whole future studies field as I've watched it here, really literally over 30 plus years of doing this work full time. My observation is, and this may be a little bit unfair, but I've been thinking about this, and Felix and I, when we chatted about me doing this podcast, we sort of settle on this as a theme because I think it's an interesting question. Future studies, when it began as an academic field, really focused, of course, on how does one assess trends and see trends of the future. Um, but a lot of the early work, and if I think of the early teachers of it, um, it kind of spun out into helping organizations define this preferred future. There was a whole organizational movement that came out of that, where there was a combination of the organizational development field and the future studies field, and a whole methodology for taking organizations over a multi-day period through a process in which they would look at the future trends and then define their preferred future, and then develop at least initial kinds of strategy ideas for how to begin moving toward that preferred future. But what I see now in future studies academically, and what I watch being practiced by many futurists have come out of these academic programs, and have very good practices. The emphasis is very much on the concept of this language, strategic foresight. And in fact, some of the academic programs, some of the best known academic programs, have in fact rebranded themselves as from being programs in future studies to programs in strategic foresight. And the emphasis is very much on, again, assisting enterprises, whether that be a community, an organization, a company, on developing foresight and developing tools that will create this foresight. It's not quite clear to me in each case what people mean by foresight, but the methodology is very much organized around emphasizing scenario planning. And I will say that since the year 2000, after the turn of the century, interestingly enough, as we approach the year 2001, and being in the field this long, as we approached the year 2001, I was there, and everybody wanted a vision for the 21st century. Everybody wanted to say, what's our vision for either the 21st century or a vision for 2020 or so? And there, I did several projects in which the title was Vision 2020. Which of course a play on our site, and the year 2020. Well, here we are in almost the year 2020. Now the emphasis is in this foresight and on scenario planning. Since the turn of the century, I did a lot of scenario planning with organizations. In fact, that became a more typical request from organizations from me. And rather than calling up and saying, we would like to create a vision and a plan, they literally would call up and say, we would like to do some scenario planning. Okay. And again, I think that strategic foresight, as practiced really around the world, is heavily organized around doing scenario planning. And the moves of scenario planning are pretty well known. They're fairly common. Pioneered, of course, to a large degree, not exclusively but to a large degree by Royal Dutch Shell. And it consists of trying to determine what are the probable trends shaping the world, and then what are the uncertainties that could change things in the future, and then creating scenarios around combinations of those probable trends and those uncertainties, and trying then to identify 3 or 4 different plausible scenarios, and then asking the enterprise you're working with to identify, well, what would you do if scenario A or scenario B or scenario D, C emerge? What would be your strategy in that situation? And to a large degree, I think that defines what people think of as strategic foresight. I've identified what might happen in the future, what is more plausible or less plausible. I've identified some even kind of implausible scenarios, and I've asked myself, what would I do if that world emerged? That's it. And I think as I read the results of these kinds of processes, and look at the methodologies that people are applying, this kind of gaming techniques, and a lot of emphasis on various kind of tools, whether they're cards that you sort, and so on. I think that we might have lost some of the emphasis, if not a great deal of the emphasis, on the early focus of future studies, which was on define your preferred future. Ask not what is going to happen in the future, but ask what do you want the future to look like, and then how do you make that future more likely to happen? Now, if I'm in the ballpark here, Felix, good. I'm watching your chat in case you want to ask a question out of this, but I've got one more place I want to take this then. So now I've done two things in my work. One, there's emphasis on vision. Let me tell you a story about that, and then I'm going to tell you what I've done with these days more classic strategic foresight move of using scenario planning. There was a community that I worked with. It was a small rural university town here in the state of Washington in the United States, and the mayor and the city council and so on said, well, we'd like to develop a new vision for the city. Our city is kind of stagnant. We do have this university. The whole city was kind of organized around this university, very small town. But we'd like to develop a new vision. I can't remember now if it was a vision for the 21st century or 2020 or what it was. But so come and help us do that. Let's involve some citizens. So we did a number of citizen meetings and asked people what they thought the future looked like, what the future trends were. We presented some information on future trends. We studied what was happening economically and demographically in the region and so on. And then we took a group of citizens and then ultimately the city leadership through a process of defining a preferred future. And you do that, we did that back in the day, and I still do it largely by helping people come up with kind of creative thinking processes for imagining possible futures and then defining their preferred future images, lots of preferred future images of what if we could do this, what if we could do that, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do this? And then narrowing those down through a choice-making process until you have a limited number, in this case we probably had about 8, key features, components of a preferred future for the city. One of them was, in the very old-fashioned way of building cities, this city had a small river that goes through the city. But in the 1800s, early 1900s, the way that you built cities in the US that had rivers in, the river would be the sewer. And so you put the backs of every building to the river, and then you ran the sewer into the river, and then everything would be carried away. So the city streets had been set up so that the city was in the back and the fronts of the buildings faced the streets. And they said, well, one of their visions was to turn that around. So for all the buildings that were on the river, to eventually turn them all around so that they face the river, the front of this, and they could have, this is a part of the state of Washington which gets quite warm in the summer. So it's wonderful to sit outside in the summer. And they could create, restaurants and verandas and patios and so on facing the river. So the river would become something that's featured instead of something to be ignored. So that's just a small story about their vision. That was what they did. They created about an 8-point vision. That was it. I left. About 5 years later, 6 years later, or so, I was in a meeting and I happened to run into the city manager from that city. And what he said was, he said, when that whole process was over, we didn't really have a plan. We didn't have a 20-point plan to do everything. He said, literally what we did was we took that 8-point vision, we put it in the drawer, and then about once every 6 months or so, the city council and I would take it out and we would look at it. And we sort of asked, so what are we doing? Are we doing anything to make this real? And he said, here we are 5, 6 years later, maybe it was even more than, maybe it was 10 years later when I saw this guy. And he said, and suddenly we sort of looked up and we said, we've done a lot of this. A lot of this has come true. And he said, it was almost like, and this was the very phrase that this guy used, he said, it was almost like that vision had a mystical power over what we then did in the city. And I've always loved that story. And I then ever since refer to sort of the mystical power of creating a vision of the preferred future. Now, what I did with that in scenario planning was when I take an organization through scenarios over the years now, and typically the outcome is you have 3 or 4 plausible scenarios and a set of strategic implications of them, and maybe you identify some triggers of how you'll know these scenarios are one scenario or another is emerging. I would say, okay, now we have all of that done. Now let's ask one more question. What is the preferred scenario? If we were going to, now that we've studied these trends and we've identified these uncertainties, we have some picture of what the future may look like. But what we haven't done is said, what do we want the future to look like? What do we want to create? And so then I will say, let's create one more scenario. It's not part of classic scenario planning, and let's define it as the preferred scenario. And let's say, in light of these trends, and almost given any uncertainty, in whichever way any uncertainty goes, what we want is this future. We want these 5 things. And we're going to do the following strategies to try to make it more likely that these 5 components of our vision become true in any given scenario. And so they walk out then with not just a set of scenarios and strategic implications, but with a preferred scenario, a preferred vision, and the strategic steps that they'll take to try to move toward it. And I think that's kind of lacking today. I don't know if you saw this, Felix, or any of the people watching this did, but over here in the U.S., there's a new young, very exciting Congresswoman, youngest ever member elected to the U.S. Congress. Her name is Olivia Ocasio-Cortez, and she's 25 years old when she got elected. And she recently collaborated in putting out a short video with illustrations, with cartoon-like illustrations of a vision for a climate future in which we've solved the climate crisis. She's one of the co-sponsors of over here with the so-called Green New Deal. And so she put together with some other people this video saying, if the Green New Deal was in place, this is the world that we want to create. And so, of course, it's a world full of solar energy and wind power and renewable energy and buildings that have been retrofitted so that they don't waste energy and so on and so forth. And that's often lacking in the climate conversation. Almost every week, and certainly frequently, we get very compelling doomsday scenarios, if you will, of if carbon dioxide continues to go into the atmosphere at an accelerating rate, and we end up with 450 parts per million, and then 500, and so on, we get X amount of sea level rise, and that does this to the Netherlands, and it does this to New York, and the following thing happens in Miami, and so on. And therefore, the report says we should change our ways and try to prevent this from happening. End of story. Well, what's missing is a positive vision. I know it sounds kind of maybe it sounds kind of silly in this context, but a vision for, let's suppose that we go completely to renewable energy between now and 2040, 2050, hopefully as soon as we can. And let's suppose that we redesign cities to emphasize walking, Amsterdam being a great, and bicycling in Amsterdam a great case. And we require all the buildings to have green roofs and so on. What does our world look like? And what kind of lifestyle then does that enable? How good could it be? I have a good friend named Ramez Nam, who's sort of a global expert on solar energy and renewable energy. And he said recently, he got a lot of pushback on Twitter about this. He said he thinks it's actually feasible to keep global warming to 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade by 2100. And that if we do that, human beings are not going to disappear. In fact, we could actually be living a better life for more people in the world than exists today. But he didn't. He got all the pushback was because he didn't say, well, how is that possible, and what would that actually look like, and so on. Essentially, what he's saying, it's possible to have a positive vision. So that's my thing. My whole career as a futurist has been really much more around the question of what is your preferred future than it's been around strategic foresight or around what kind of future do you want. I've taken at least 15, 20, 25 minutes. So maybe I'll just pause there. So you're saying I now have a chance to address a wish to our audience, and I'll be happy to do that. Um, you know, we live. Oh, this is my wish for the audience, for everybody, in particular everybody who's interested in future and in the future, yeah, and whether that's your personal future or one for your company or your community. And I've said this a few times, but what I think we need to do is to really imagine ourselves pushing a restart button on the 21st century. Uh, I really started this sort of deep futures work in the 1990s. And the Soviet Union had fallen, the Berlin Wall had come down. It was possible to imagine declining defense spending. We were worried about something called Y2K. Uh, but it was possible to imagine a much different 21st century than we had in the 20th century. And then we got into the whole problem of terrorism in the early 21st century. And now we're caught in this deep crisis of global warming. And what we really need to do is to imagine a big red reset button that we can push and reset the 21st century. And I think that one of the things we need, in addition to good strategic foresight, are more projects creating the kind of vision that we want for the year 2150 or 2050 or 2100 or even 2150, if you will, 100 years plus from now. And if we do that, perhaps we'll get a better 21st century. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me.